What is autistic burnout, and how can we as professionals have neuro-affirming environments for our clients? These are just a couple of the questions that we discussed today. Welcome to episode 136 of the Autism Outreach Podcast. I am your host, Rose Griffin, and I had an amazing conversation today with Larissa Minner. She is a passionate an experienced disability rights advocate, speaker, and consultant with a deep commitment to promoting understanding. Larissa has become a sought-after voice in the field. Her expertise in neurodivergence, coupled with her exceptional research and writing skills, make her a trusted thought leader. As an autistic person with multiple disabilities, Larissa blends her speaking engagements with research and lived experience. We have an amazing conversation today. I actually found out about Larissa's work because she did a presentation for a conference that I have been very involved with for the past almost 20 years here in the Cleveland area. And I saw her presentation come through my desk and I thought, okay, this is a person that I have to meet, and I want all of my listeners to also meet and listen to her. And she just has such great information to share today. With her unwavering dedication, extensive expertise, and influential work, Larissa continues to drive positive change in the field of disability rights. Her passion and accomplishments encourage others to join her in creating a more inclusive and accessible world. I'm so excited for you to listen to my conversation today.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
Thanks so much for joining us on episode 136 of the Autism Outreach Podcast. We have a great episode for you today. We have with us Larissa Minner. Thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yay. And I learned about your work. I'm part of this executive conference committee. That's just fancy because I've been a part of this conference for so long here in Cleveland called Milestones. And your name came up, and I think I maybe read one of your proposals or something. That's part of what I do on that conference committee. And I was like, oh, I haven't heard of her work before. And so I thought you'd be a great guest here for the podcast. So thanks so much for coming on. And for those of us that are new to you and your work, can you tell us a little bit about you and kind of your journey into the field?
Yes. So I'm an autistic individual. I prefer identity first language, so I'll be using that. And I'm an autistic ADHDer. I also have speech, because I consider this all part of my neurodivergence identity. I actually have speech apraxia and cluttering of speech and dyspraxia. But to me, it all is part of my journey into advocacy because I grew up navigating an environment that was not made for me. So I was labeled as difficult at age 2. It was a professional that was with me for like just within minutes, and he wasn't even supposed to be seeing me, and he labeled me as difficult. And it was for things like being talkative or hyperactive and having a lower tolerance to sensory data, which are, neurodivergent traits for sure. And to keep a long story short, I think because of what I experienced, and I would like to say that's with some privilege as a white person that speaks and one without intellectual disability, I was misdiagnosed as having a borderline intellectual disability when I'm actually found out I'm twice exceptional. I have a intellectual giftedness, but because of that, I have a compassion, and I also, even in elementary school, I was placed in facilities to live in, and I went through bullying and social exclusion throughout my life and problems of employment and education. But the positive thing, I swear it's happening, is that I learned that I'm not alone. But not just that I'm not alone, but there's a whole movement to change things, and that's what I'm passionate about. Advocating for others, and I'm hoping for a better future. Yeah, that's my story in a nutshell. I know it's a lot to unpack.
Well, I love that. And I love that you're advocating, because I feel like that's something that's so very important. And you have that lived experience that, a lot of people that listen to my podcasts are, parents. I'm sure there's some autistic adults and speech therapists and BCBAs. But I think that, obviously my whole passion is really helping all autistic learners have a voice and a way to communicate. And I think the way that we can be better practitioners is to listen to, people who have been through it. And now that you're advocating for change, which I think is so positive, because I always say, when we know better, we do better. And that is something that is a real initiative for us here on the podcast, is to have autistic individuals on to talk about, what has been helpful and what are you working on now. And I know at Milestones, you talked about, your talk looked really interesting. I haven't, you asked before we pressed record, have you listened to anything? But oh my gosh, I'm like, my 3 kids are home now and I'm just trying to work 2 hours a day. It's like very hard to do all the things, but I'm excited to listen to your talk eventually. But I know you talked about autistic burnout, and I feel like, we talk a lot about just self-care. We talk about, I had a BCBA on in May, and she went through actual burnout, had to step away from her job, actually works now as a wedding events planner, has an Instagram where she talks about ABA and things like that. But it was very big kind of mental health breakdown for her. And so we talked about burnout from that way. But I saw in your talk that you talked about autistic burnout. And I was just curious because I haven't heard much about that. And I'm just wondering if you can share with us, what does that really mean? And I think that's important for us to know as practitioners.
Of course. And I'm really glad you asked. I would like to add that you bring up a good point. So part of what I'm advocating for that I could use help with is advocating for more research, autistic-led research, because it's grossly understudied. Mm-hmm. We've made progress, but we need more studies, to be honest. But it's definitely, there's evidence, and it's a real phenomenon. I would like to say that. But I also believe there's a neurodivergent burnout. So I just wanted to point that out. Mm-hmm. So it's, even though we often hear about autistic burnout, I've been around enough people that if someone is an ADHDer, they have experienced something that is very similar. So I want to put that out there. And so everyone knows about burnout, right? For work. So imagine that, imagine it affects pretty much every aspect of your life. Yeah. And not only that, so it can look differently for everyone, but some common features of it is having an increase in executive function challenges. And that's just higher order thinking skills for organization, planning, flexible thinking. It's a whole set of skills, but that's a very common feature of autistic burnout. And then also having a lowered coping skills. It can also mimic and cause depression, anxiety. So those can be a misdiagnosis, and it can contribute to it. It's also thought to be a major risk factor for suicidal ideation and suicide, which is one of the bigger causes of mortality in autistic individuals. Mm-hmm. So this isn't something to take lightly. And it can also cause a regression in skills, or it can look like you lost skills. Yeah. There's a whole set of it. And what people don't talk about enough, and I've read some studies, I won't get too much into the research, but there's a thought that it could potentially explain, it needs to be further research, but it could potentially explain some of the early regression. So that definitely needs to be further studied. But that's a theory that's been brought out there that I don't know if that's, it needs to be studied, but it's an interesting theory. Yeah. And as a child, I definitely experienced it. So I was definitely an autistic burnout off and on through my life, for sure, looking back. And I would just briefly, I know this is kind of at least in my line of work, is a controversial topic, but honestly, as an adult, it got so bad. And I didn't realize it was an autistic burnout that I had to seek out applied behavior analysis as an adult. Yeah. And my insurance covered it. But at the time I was navigating, I have chronic health conditions, which are common with, which again, because I've talked to so many people and all this stuff is related. Yeah. The only way my insurance would pay for someone to go back with me, I mean, advocate was for me to pursue ABA. And then we found out that it wasn't on me. It was actually doctor specific. But my point is, this is really common. So basically, with every setting, community, education, higher education, employment, social, we're in environments that are not made for us. And then we're also experiencing social exclusion and employment, and I'm not trying to be focused on the negativity, but it is honestly a broken system. At times it feels like that. So I just want to make sure you understand, because imagine doing that and having like extreme brain fog and feeling physically fatigued. And which, if you've had brain fog, it can feel awful. And then having to find a job. I mean, that's, or go through university where they're not adequately accommodating or allowing for breaks. And
that's hard. Do you know who Robin Rosigno is? Do you know that name?
Sounds familiar, but I'm not sure.
Oh, I feel like you guys, I have to introduce. Yeah. So Robin Rosigno is a doctor now. She became a special education teacher. Her brother had, I believe, autism. She was on episode 50, I think, of my podcast. We talked about autism in girls. But anyway, she has a very large TikTok following. That's how I found her. She became a special ed teacher. Then she realized as an adult that she had autism, and she got diagnosed with autism, and she's gone on to get her PhD. She's not like a proponent for ABA, but she helps parents get services that are helpful for their children. Obviously, I'm a BCBA, so I do believe in the power of ABA. But I had her on the podcast, and it was just interesting to hear. Since she's gotten her PhD, she has made some TikToks about how she's just been talking about her employment and how she's been struggling. And then throughout her PhD, like just some of the struggles she's had as an autistic female. I should introduce you guys. I think you guys would have a good time chatting about things. But yeah, I just feel like it's great to talk about those things. We had an autistic adult on last month and a BCBA from New Mexico. And I guess they have really good adult services out there. I don't know if you've heard about this through insurance. It's like covered and better than any other state. I was very fascinated by listening to this because I've worked with middle school, high school students for the past 10 years. And I know that there's just like no funding once people get older. And it was interesting. It was called compassionate care. And so he talked all about how ABA has been helpful for him and just like setting up like all these systems, and how, he also has some medical issues, but he is able to work. And just, it was very interesting to talk about. It was called Compassionate Circle of Care. And I'm sure you're kind of working on the same things. Anytime I think you have any type of, I have a family member with a chronic like medical condition. It's like, you have to have a team and there's no resting. It's like a very ongoing machine of like support and things like that. So thank you so much for sharing that. That information is helpful. Definitely.
I just want to add, because you're on me, what I'm sure we'll talk about briefly later, but I am a primary investigator on a research study that's ongoing for healthcare, and that's looking at universal design, which other people are looking at, which are changes everyone has access to. I bring that up because that's part of a neuro-affirming environment, is access to universal design. So I just wanted to mention that briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things we want to talk about today. And I know that it could be like a day-long talk, but can you share with us some ways that we can assure, as therapists, that we're creating a neuro-affirming environment? And I think, the idea of, like neurodiversity, I know it's a whole movement, and I feel like everybody's kind of on their journey as far as, implementing things, or, I've had my podcast 2 years. And so I remember episode 16, I had Nathan Morgan on. He's actually an autistic adult who works at Milestones, the conference you just presented at. But we were talking about things 2 years ago that were very simplistic, like, do I say autism or do I say autistic? And what's absolutely crazy to me is that I will get a hate comment probably once a month. It's not that often, about I shouldn't say autistic. And it's like, for me, that's like so 2 years ago. Like I do say autistic. I like that you said you do that on purpose. And sometimes I forget to even say that because I I feel like here on my journey of listening to autistic adults that was like something I changed in my vocabulary a long time ago. But some people might just not be sure, what does it mean to be neuro-affirming, and what are some things that we can start thinking about and start implementing?
Okay, there's a ton, but you actually brought up one, and that's using the person's language preference and asking. That can go a long way. I've had professionals correct me that I'm a person with autism, and sometimes I pick my battles, but that showing that you care about and value someone for their opinion. So is it okay if I just share like a brief analogy? Yeah. So I didn't come up with it completely, but I modified it a little bit, but I think it helps. Is that so diversity is asking someone to the school dance.
Right.
Inclusion is being asked to dance. Acceptance is being asked for input on the playlist. And then belonging is being invited to join the leadership team. And then I like to add that social justice would be getting paid for it, but it doesn't quite fit the metaphor. But the reason why I bring that up is because often I think it's performative. I'm not saying everyone is doing like performative allyship.
Yes.
But it's something I see where I feel like they're trying, but they may not know where to start, which again, you brought up a good point, asking people with lived experience, depending on what you're doing, having advisory boards. If someone's developing a curriculum or a program, I would like to see them try to get like an advisory board, and ideally some of that would be paid for people with different disabilities and including non-speaking people and people with intellectual disabilities and stuff like that. That's what I would like to see happen more. Yeah. And it should be in the beginning of the process, not an afterthought. So that it goes back to universal design. Yeah. Because if there's environments that are not sensory friendly, that's going to impair learning, and it's going to contribute. That's one of the major factors for autistic burnout. Yeah. Is sensory. So when I say environment, I mean both physical and emotional. I basically mean, social interaction as well as environment. But I like to personally focus on what we can do as a society together and what professionals can do. Right. And that would be for the physical environment. I'll just be real brief. Some of the more simple things are alternatives to fluorescent lighting, having blinds or curtains, while being mindful, because sometimes people are blind or have low vision, and then that can make it worse, or it can make it harder to navigate. But having adjustable lighting, asking in general if someone's comfortable, if it's some people don't like to be asked, so always go by the person. But being mindful of that, because I think often the burden is on the autistic individual, and sometimes sunglasses and having noise cancellation headphones and earplugs do not work, and they're not always comfortable for people, and it can impair other things. So I feel like being mindful of the environment and the person's need, and which brings me to my next point, language. So I'm not saying people need to use these terms. So I came up with I believe I came up with some neuro-affirming language, and let me know if I'm going too fast. I get excited.
No, I love it. I love it. Okay.
So some of the language that I personally prefer to use, because people talk about like rigid behavior and routines. Right. And it could be neutral, but it also sometimes feels like it's deficit based. So I like to think of myself as a strategic explorer, or some people just say they have a preference for routine. Okay. And it may seem like a subtle difference or semantics, but it feels like it's not as deficit focused. Yeah. And also when you think about someone may prefer structure to explore their environment, it can help you think that you need to let them know. So even something professionals can do is consider if there's a change in the environment, I consider it best practice if it's going to be like, it can make a big difference to warn ahead, and that can help people with other disabilities, including people who are deaf or hard hearing and visual. are blind. So it's not just autism, but it can go a long way, because if you're changing your environment, it can cause problems. So that's a not subtle, but that's a small thing that people don't think of. And also warning ahead for events. So because if I know what's happening, I can plan ahead and offering like safe places of retreat. Another thing is thinking about kinetic. So I consider myself a kinetic listener at times. And the reason I bring that up is you can acknowledge that there are differences. So I believe there are different and valid ways to listen, show empathy, express my emotions, communicate, and they're all valid to me.
Right.
And for me, and a lot of autistic people, everyone's different, and I won't be the same day to day or even the same day. So it's dynamic. Right. But I may need to look away, and I may need to fidget. I may need to pace.
Right.
Or do stimming or self-regulatory movements. And I'm listening, but if you expect, or if someone expects me to sit still when I'm in a kinetic listening mode, and they want me to just sit still and make eye contact and nod and back channel, which is, going,
right.
Things like that.
I just did it, I think.
Yeah. I'm not saying I'm always going to be doing that, but I wasted so much time in my life trying to like get that down that where I was missing whole conversations and learning because I was so focused on I need to there was comments made that I wasn't listening, but I was listening. I just wasn't listening in the neurotypical way. And people, when asked would you ask a neurotypical to act autistic? And again, autistic behavior is human behavior.
Right.
But I always like to point out that as an autistic person, I'm not going to be neurotypical.
Right.
But the listening styles and you don't have to be autistic to have that type of listening style, but it's something that people don't think about. And then I also like to talk briefly about echoic learning. So that's what I call echolalia. Yeah. Which is, I know but like repeating phrases or sayings that you've heard spoken, and gestalt learning as well. So I think this is so underused. And I honestly think that I could have benefited from this being recognized when I was younger. I think it was besides having speech apraxia, I think it led to some delays with reading. But something that you and their as a speech language pathologist can do would be validate. Yeah. Because I think I'm hoping that this is something that's commonly taught, and there are resources, but is it not?
About echolalia? Well, it's a hot topic. I really don't. I did take the Gestalt. I'm friends with the girl who put together this Gestalt course, but you know what she said to me, because I get asked about it a lot and I haven't done a podcast on it or anything. I think what is most helpful, whether you're going to go down and you believe that's how language is acquired, and everybody's going to have a different thought. But I think the thought of obviously, I want to go back to your point about how you're listening, but you're not maybe always making eye contact and your body is like busy, or, how you described it. I do think there's a very antiquated ways where people are still thinking that kids need to be still. And, there's still people out there talking about working on eye contact directly. But this is one of those, when you know better, you do better. And I say 10 years ago, I've been practicing 20. So 10 years ago, probably 12 years ago, I just stopped writing goals for eye contact, not because autistic adults were talking on Instagram and TikTok and all the places I listen to information, but because I just didn't think it was impactful, because I don't think that we need to shape up strange goals for that. But there are still people out there who are writing stuff like that. There are still people out there who say nice, quiet body, which just makes me irk, because it's like, why? You can and I don't know if it's because I've lived my experience as a speech therapist. Like, I have kids that they don't look at me. They're obviously autistic, but they're listening to me and we're having a conversation. I don't know why. And sometimes what's hard as a school-based speech therapist, which I'm not anymore, I did that for 20 years, but sometimes what's hard as a school-based speech therapist is the parent wants you to work on maybe eye contact, or turn taking and an 8-step conversation about a non-preferred topic. Sometimes that's a whole other podcast, but sometimes as a provider, I think it's good to talk about these things because we know that we can do better and we shouldn't be setting goals for that. But sometimes you're kind of pigeonholed into these weird spots when you're on an IEP team, because when you're in the public school, it's not all about what you think. It's about what the parent wants. And if the child's not yet speaking, that's where it gets really complicated,
Okay. So I'm going to add my 2 cents, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I would like to think that most parents have their child's best interests in mind. I believe educating, if I feel like educating in plain language about autistic burnout and saying this is something that's being researched, it's many autistic individuals experience this, and it can cause so many problems, and including and explaining that they could be potentially causing physical discomfort. Because sometimes when I've made myself stay still and I needed to stem, it was unbearable.
Yeah.
And I was also putting myself through sensory situations where I was having physical pain, and I've heard this so many times.
Yeah.
And some people even will resort to like self-injurious, self-regulatory behavior because they're being told to do all of these things, like make eye contact while there's loud music and they're in literal pain.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that to scare parents, but I don't think parents are being taught about autistic burnout, because I've talked to enough parents that I don't think they're regularly doing that. They're having to educate themselves, and not everyone is able to do that. So I would suggest, if that's something that someone's in a place, that's a big thing you could do. Because I would like to think that people don't want to put someone through that. I could be wrong, but I want to believe that if there's understanding about what it can feel like, that could help foster compassion.
I like that.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah. No, I love that. I think that's important. Yeah. And I just think it's an ongoing dialogue. Yeah.
And another thing is studies, but I also like to say that a lot of, I think, helps is that studies are showing, and I can say this as an autistic individual, it's really a different. So they're still studying it, but based on numerous experiences, I'm not saying put autistic people with other autistic people, because obviously we should be included. But my point is that it's a very valid way of doing things, of speaking, of, it's just fairly valid. And I don't have to mask. And by masking, it's like hiding autistic traits or behavior. And that's often a defensive mechanism. And I would like to say that even elementary school, I remember practicing facial expressions and tone of voice and all this stuff. And nobody told me to do those things. I just knew to do it.
Right.
And that can contribute to autistic burnout. So I feel like a lot of this is education.
Yeah.
And I would like to point one thing that I think could go a long way, and I would like more people to join me on this. I wanted to say it's Connecticut, but one state has been successful so far, is if people could advocate for for education about disability, starting in kindergarten through 12th grade, because developmental psychologists say that early childhood is the best time to start before onsetting prejudice starts in. And you can do things like focus on common ground, similarities, correct misconceptions, and the importance of inclusion. And also making sure there's stuff that incorporates passionate interests, which I think you tapped into earlier, like having social groups, or sometimes some people like Dungeons and Dragons. It's just, there's lots of different things that can be utilized. And I would also personally like to see sensory classrooms offered, but if that's going to be done, I feel like they should probably have at least a certain amount of students that don't identify as having a disability, just to make sure. But I think letting the child and the parent can give input, choose. I don't know if that's a hot take, but I feel like when I was younger, I was able to say that this wasn't working, but my parents listened, but the school didn't listen. And it was a big mess, to be honest.
Yeah,
So
sensory.
I think, yeah, choices are a big thing. What were you saying?
Yeah. So sensory, I mean, I think, no, just from like a very generic, like sensory is a whole thing. I had one of my best friends is an OT, PhD level OT. She actually came on the podcast. We met because we both worked with autistic learners. Now she does something, she's a professor, but she came on and talked about sensory. It was very interesting, not specific to autism, but just in general. But I think sensory, well, it's interesting now just in the general public that I feel like all those types of fidgets are really popular, like fidget spinners and poppets and the bracelets with the, that's not just like, I feel like 10 years ago, that would have been like maybe an autistic type thing you would think from an outsider. But now I feel like there's lots of different fidgets, sensory toys, like even if I go to conferences, some people are just like up walking around. I feel like, and I'm just this normal person that is like a speech therapist, but over 20 years, I feel like that type of stuff is more acceptable. It's like, oh, well, I'm not going to sit. I mean, back in the day, it would just be like, what is that person doing? I feel like now, I know it's just small, but I feel like there are more levels of acceptance of, well, that's just how that person learns, or that's how, so I know we're just in the beginning stages of that. But I like that idea of, yeah, just talking about disability right from the get-go, because with the incidence rate being 1 in 36, we all are friends with, love somebody, have a neighbor who has autism. So I think it's just part of our society.
I suspect, I'm don't quote me, I suspect it's higher. I really do. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but there's so many people.
Did you meet?
That's a whole nother.
Did you meet Carly Jalowick at Milestones? Do you know who that is?
I've interacted with her through email. She's amazing.
Okay. Yeah. So she was on my podcast. I forget what episode. It might have been like 101. And she, throughout her high school, she was diagnosed as maybe having depression and anxiety and some different types of things. And then I think this is how it goes. She was on Google or something looking up autism and characteristics because she thought her dad might have autism. I think this is the story. And she looked it up and then she started reading through the list and she was like, oh, okay, this sounds like me. And then she did get a formal diagnosis. I mean, later in life, and she was able to get a formal diagnosis and she has autism. And so she came on the podcast and we talked, but it was just really fascinating. Like where you said, like sometimes if people are masking, that may cause depression or, thoughts of suicide and all these things that we as practitioners, like 24 years ago when I was in school, we never talked about this stuff. Like it was like, do a social skills lunch bunch. And it was like very like, it's just like, we're growing as a field is what I'm saying. So I think it's important to share these things because I think if anything, it just needs to make people analyze, like, why are you working what you're working on? And are you being compassionate in how you're goal setting? And are you talking about these types of things? Because when we were in school, I mean, it was never addressed, like never, not one time did we talk about somebody who has a disability. There were no guest speakers, it was just, It just wasn't the case. So I feel like this is a move in the right direction, at least.
I was just unpacking what you were saying. Yeah, I think to go back to what you're saying about Carly, what you brought up a valid point. I'll just be real brief because misdiagnosis and misdiagnosis is really common. I was misdiagnosed and I was treated for bipolar disorder, which I 100% do not have, but that can happen with autism.
Right.
But I was misdiagnosed with that. And I think that was actually one of the reasons why my autistic burnout got as bad as it did, because they kept upping my medication and upping it. And it got like, yeah. So that was a whole different thing. But part of what I feel like professionals could do is question themselves. So with intersectionality, when there's stuff like gender or race or other factors, I know we made progress, but often people may be questioning it when someone's a white, straight, cis boy. They might think about autism, but I think another thing could be like questioning it, like if you would refer out or diagnose someone, that is like why aren't you doing that for somebody else? And that I feel like that can go a long way to like question the unconscious biases. Because one thing that I did is I became very quiet at a certain point in my life. And it was a coping mechanism because I knew that when I talked, I got myself in trouble and it didn't go well. And because I was a girl, it was thought of as a shy trait. And it was something that just, got ignored.
Yeah.
There's something else I want to read up that you said, but I forgot.
Maybe it'll come to you. Well, tell us a little bit about your work, your advocacy work. Like, what are you doing in the field now? Can you tell us what you're working on?
Okay, I'm working on a lot. So I want to tackle, I know this isn't a one person thing, but I'm wanting to tackle healthcare, education, including higher education and employment, because it all ties together 100%. So I already brought up, I'm trying to advocate for the early education on disability. I think that's going to help, but that's something I'll help more in the long term. I'm advocating about universal design. I've talked to companies like PayPal about their hiring processes and how to be inclusive. I've been on panels to talk to correction officers at schools, how to interact with people with disabilities. I have that original research study on healthcare. I've also done things like I had a YouTube. I still have it. I'm going to go back to it eventually, but I actually did little videos where I played like autistic superheroes that had actual powers, and they were comedies, but I was trying to appeal to the wider public to teach topics in a simple and fun way. So I'm also very likely going to start my own podcast soon. So I'm doing a lot, and I'm also on like disability organizations, national organizations. I'm a co-secretary of one, and I speak. All
the things.
All the things, yeah. but it's so much needed.
It is, absolutely. So where can people find out more about you and your work? I'm wondering, did you send me a link? We usually have show notes. So if you have a website or a link where people can find out more about you and your work, we can definitely include that in the show notes as well. Yes.
Okay. So one that I can say off the top of my head is larissaminner.com is a website that I have. And then on the show notes, there should be the link tree that has different social medias I'm on. I just don't have that memorized.
I have it right here. Okay. It is. It's part of your bio. Okay. We'll make sure to include that. Well, wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much for coming on. It was just such a joy to talk with you, and I really appreciate your time today.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.